thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nicola, for having organized all this. Let's go straight ahead with, and I think it's right that it's Clelia who's beginning. So Clelia Crialesi is, well, at the moment, or at least just about to be, an FWO junior researcher at KU Leuven. And we have all those initials, but I believe that is the proper name of the university, isn't it? KU. It's sort of lost the initials sort of survive on their own. So let me not take up any more time, and we're all waiting to hear you, and hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Many thanks for the introduction, and thank you all for being here today. I see so many familiar faces and so many specialists of the topic I'm going to discuss. So it is really a pleasure and an honor to share my views with you on this occasion. You might want to have my handout at hand. I don't know if you received it, but it is an 8 pages handout containing some Latin text with work in progress translations. I'm not going to read it entirely, of course, but you can find in it the text that I'm going to refer to. So these texts are intended to support my statements, but you can follow my presentation still without my handout. As the title of my paper reveals, I will mainly focus on 2 understandings of prime matter at Chartres. But before I go into details, I think it is worth specifying the reason why I preferred to use the generic expression at Chartres rather than School of Chartres. And the reason is basically that I do not intend to address, at least not here today, the issue of the existence or non-existence of a specific group of masters concretely linked to a cathedral school in the south of Paris during the 12th century. Rather, I would broadly hold that the link among masters such as Thierry of Chartres and William of Conches is essentially theoretical, rather than grounded on their presence at a certain cathedral school. To give you a little bit of context, Thierry was master and chancellor of Chartres in the decade starting from 1140, before retiring in a monastery until his death around 1156. Whereas from the 1145, William was the tutor of the Duke of Normandy, Geoffrey Plantagenet, and it is still uncertain whether he ever taught at Chartres or not. But for now, let us put aside the issue of the appropriateness of speaking of a Chartian school, to which rivers of ink have been devoted in the past century. And let us agree that when talking of Chartian masters like Thierry and William, we refer to a group of thinkers that share specific philosophical interests and questions that they develop on the basis of a precise set of textual sources, among which Plato's Timaeus, of course, in Chalcidius' translation and accompanied by Chalcidius' commentary, Macrobius, Priscian's, Boethius' work, as well as Arabic texts on physics and medicine, like, for instance, Constantine the African's Pantagruel. The consistency of these textual sources does not prevent them from answering their shared questions differently. And the case study of prime matter is an instance of this way of considering the Chartrian thinkers, since we can notice the development of 2 different answers to one single question, namely what matter is. Indeed, both Thierry's and William's thoughts on prime matter move within a creationist frame and stem from the same need of offering a reasonable explanation of the divine work of creation, pursuing a rational inquiry of natural phenomena, and defending the role played by the secondary causes. So on the one hand, we have William's specific understanding that is more oriented towards natural philosophy. And on the other hand, we have Thierry's explanation, which is arithmetically informed and marginally involves, I would say not marginally, involves a modal theory of the cosmos. Of course, things are more complex than how I'm depicting them, but if we want to uncover the core of Williams and Thierry's reflection on prime matter and on matter in general, it might be useful to stick to these two broad categorizations, the physics for William and the metaphysics for Thierry. And I will try to prove this point starting with William of Conches. William's opinion on the nature of prime matter develops throughout his career and all his writings. Matter can coincide with the four elements, fire, air, water, and earth, as it is the case of his glosses on Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy, or it is conceived as something preceding, containing, or common to the four elements, something created by God, something which is capable of receiving the qualities and the forms, and something that can be grasped in a very specific way by the intellect as well as by the senses. And this is explained in his glosses on Plato's Timaeus. All these points are reported in the texts on the handout from T1 to T4. In these passages, we can quickly notice William's physically oriented understanding of matter. For instance, in text T4, after stating that Eule, the prime matter, cannot be conceived by the intellect unless by a lack of the intellect itself, defectu intellectus, that is, by depriving Eule of those features like qualities and forms that are usually involved in grasping everything that exists concretely, William in T4 also adds that Eule can be somehow perceived in its effects, namely by observing and precisely perceiving the mutual transformations of the elements. Moreover, as it is shown in text T3, William, at least in his glosses on Plato's Timaeus, conceived the prime matter not as a potentiality, but rather as the substrate or the place in which the changes of one element into another take place. And I think that this metaphysically weakened conception of prime matter as something in quo, in which all the physical variations happen, is the very basis of William's inquiry into the material substrate underlying the physical reality. And this is also clear in text T5, still from William's glosses on Plato's Timaeus, in which matter is called necessity, but simply because it cannot subsist. It cannot subsist without the bodies, nor can the body subsist without it. And this leads us to another distinctive feature of William's thought concerning the material substrate. I am referring to William's physical atomism expressed in his last work, namely the Dragmaticon, which is a dialogue between a master and a duke, possibly in all likelihood between William himself and the Duke of Normandy. Taking up a definition offered by Hermann of Carinthia, William, in text T6, refers to the element, the elementum, as what is found first in the composition of a body and last in its resolution. These elements, these kinds of elementa, do not correspond to the four physical elements, as they are not composed of anything else and cannot be further divided. In other words, these elementa are minima, that is, the smallest particles, simple with respect to both quality and quantity. Infinity, visibility, and corporality are the features that characterize these particles. In text T7, they are said to be infinite in number, but not because their number constantly changes or increases, but inasmuch as their number is indefinite and cannot be grasped by the human intellect. In text T8, William maintains that the particles are indeed perceivable, inasmuch as they can be perceived by the senses when they form an aggregate. Differently from the particles, that which is truly imperceptible cannot be perceived neither alone nor when conjoined to other things of the same kind. For instance, we cannot perceive a single human soul, and we cannot perceive a multitude of human souls. Finally, as reported in text T9, still from William's Drachmaticon, William specifies that the particles can be said to be corporeal, if only we acknowledge that we are displacing the meaning of the noun body. According to William, we impose the name body precisely to bodies, hence by translatio, by displacing the meaning of the noun body, we refer the meaning of this noun to the principles of the bodies themselves. Therefore, in this sense, we can say that the particles are corporeal. But to remove any doubts that William is really defending a form of physical atomism, in text T10, we can read his open endorsement to the Epicureans. Indeed, states William, indeed they spoke the truth about the world consisting of atoms. However, they were wrong in stating that the atoms are without beginning, scattered through the void, and then clustered together to form the four elements. This setting leads William to support the existence of a primordial chaos, text T11, namely of a primordial body in which the particles were blended together and were not yet locally discrete. Now, I cannot see any conflict between William's earlier reading of Plato's prime matter and his later atomism expressed in the Drachmaticon. From William's perspective, the Timaean matter has no particular metaphysical strength, for of course it is created, but especially because it is a substrate in which the elements interact. And this made him switch from talking about a primordial matter to talking about a primordial body, that is the chaos in which the atoms are mingled. In fact, his atomism is not actually a metaphysical doctrine, for the atoms are mere physical principles of the bodies. This unique understanding was determined by William's choice of not including the notion of potentiality within his analysis of prime matter. And differently, Thierry of Chartres bases his view on matter precisely on this notion. So let us now turn to Thierry. As I already stated, Thierry's conception of matter, as well as his whole thought, is mathematically inspired, arithmetically inspired, so that we can label his philosophy as Neo-Pythagorean. The starting point to grasp Thierry's understanding of matter is his correlation between, on the one hand, the ontological and metaphysical levels, and on the other hand, the arithmetical and the numerical levels. This is exemplified by one of Thierry's most famous theories, namely that the creation of numbers is the creation of all beings, as it is stated in his exegetical text on the 6 works of creation, text T12. It is not surprising then to find this conception of matter also embedded in his explanations of the lemmata of Boethius de Arithmetica. The Neo-Pythagorean principles that structure the Boethian number theory are the lens through which theory looks at those principles that underlie the reality as a whole. The arithmetical notions that are relevant to the present analysis, to our analysis, are those concerning the first 2 natural numbers, namely the number 1 and the number 2. According to Thierry, the number 1 is the source and the cause of the generation of the infinite series of natural numbers. It is the equality ratio, 1 to 1, from which any kind of inequality ratio can be derived. And it is also the aliquot part that is common to all the natural numbers, for the number is a collection of units, as it is clarified by Boethius in his De Arithmetica. All these mirrors a metaphysical setting. According to Thierry, the causality of the number 1 reflects the infinite power of the Creator's action on all the created beings. God is the simplest unity that precedes any kind of multiplicity, and he is the form of being, the forma essendi, in which everything created participates in order to be, and to be in its specific way. But the arithmetical notion of the unity also reverberates within the ontological realm, since everything that exists in as much as it is one in number. In other words, being one corresponds to being and vice versa. So what is the form of being that every creature participates in? That is to say that every creature is one in as much as it aims to, tends towards the divine unity, desiring to be one and participating of that divine form of being, which is the absolute one. This is the reason why theory defines both God and the unity as entitas or onitas of the created beings. And we might render these terms as the deepest essence. Now, another arithmetical consideration helps us appreciate another aspect of the correlation between the metaphysical ontological realm and the numerical one. And it precisely involves theory's conception of matter. As we can read directly in text T15, the unity comes first than every number, and it is simple and identical to itself. In turn, the number 2, being the first multiple number, withdraws from that simplicity and identity. For as one can say that the only unity is one can consequently say that the 2 itself is other than that unity. And thus, this is the principle of otherness, of alterity. End of quotation. Theory identifies the principle of alterity with the first number created by the unity, that is the number 2. The principle of alterity encompasses all the mutable beings, and matter is its ontological correspondent, coinciding with the mutability itself of the created beings. Together with the form, matter is the component of every corporeal substance. But since it intrinsically expresses the diversity, the mutability, and the plurality, it needs to be actualized and unified by the form, which provides it with an essential consistency and uniformity. From this perspective, the union of form and matter expresses the interaction between unity and alterity, between singularity and multiplicity among and within the created beings. Now, there is a detail that needs to be added to this reasoning. Matter is not simply the equivalent of the principle of alterity. As theory specifies, matter is as theory specifies in its commentary on Boethius, the Arithmetica, text 16, matter is the bearer of the power of duality, what he calls vis dualitatis or vis imparitatis, while the form is the bearer of the power of the unity, the vis imparitatis. According to theory, these two fundamental powers or forces, vires, of the unity and alterity, reside within the corporeal substances. These powers arise in matter and form, and yet they do not seem to coincide with them. More specifically, in text T16, for instance, the powers of the unity and alterity are said to be found within matter and form, and indeed, the mutability of matter derives from such power. This is a key passage for Thierry's account of hylomorphism, since it allows him to offer a solution to the issue of the hylomorphic composition of non-corporeal, non-material, and spiritual substances, ruling out a universal hylomorphism of matter and form for all beings. This has been arguably shown by Nicola Polloni in an article in which Thierry's hylomorphism is retraced also by comparing it to Gondisalino's account. So Thierry's solution is expressed again in his commentary on the Arithmetica, text T17, and is the following. Every being, corporeal and spiritual, is composed by the metaphysical constituents of identity and diversity, ex eodem et diverso, which ultimately correspond to the unity and alterity, of course. Differently from the spiritual beings, the corporeal substances are composed of matter and form, which in turn are only expressions of such metaphysical constituents, for they bear only the powers of identity and diversity. Thierry exemplifies this distinction by recalling the case study of the case of the human soul. I quote from text 17, the underlined part. The human soul, although it does not consist of matter and form, it nevertheless consists of identity and diversity. Since the human soul moves, and where there is the movement, there is also change from one place or position into another, but also from one condition, one state into another, we might translate it. End of quotation. Now, I would like to invite you to evaluate if Thierry's explanation of the holomorphic composition of spiritual beings is adequate. For now, I will just observe its implications. The soul moves and thus changes its condition, namely it moves between potency and act. And this dynamic is due to the components of identity and diversity. In other words, they do not necessarily need to be composed of matter and form to express this dynamic, and still their composition is granted. Like the spiritual beings contemplate the passage from potentiality into actuality thanks to the principle of identity and diversity, the corporeal substances do the same thanks to matter and form, which in turn are only the expressions of these powers, are only powers of these principles. So in his commentary on the De Arithmetica, the juxtaposition of matter and potentiality is already present, but still not elaborated in detail. To find Thierry's finest conception of matter as pure potentiality, we need to look at this modal theory of the cosmos developed in his Lecciones on Boethius de Trinitate. When discussing the nature of the universe, Thierry offers a modalized cosmological scheme, a scheme that makes use of modal concepts like necessity and possibility. And it is convenient to read directly Thierry's words, text T18. The universe is conceivable in four modes. One and the same universe exists in absolute necessity, in necessity of complexion, necessitas complexionis, which is a quite obscure concept, in absolute possibility, and in determinate possibility. The universe exists in absolute necessity, in a certain simplicity and union of all things, which is God. It exists in necessity of complexion, in a certain order or progression, but immutably. It exists in absolute possibility without any actuality, and it exists in determinate possibility, both possibly and actually. I skip a few lines. Absolute possibility is the enfolding, the complicatio, of that same universe in pure possibility from which all things come to actuality. This possibility, the physicists call primordial matter and chaos. End of quote. As David Albertson has already explained, Thierry thinks of the universe as two parallel orders of being that are the necessity or actuality and the possibility or potentiality, which are intertwined with two parallel orders of folding, the enfolding or complicatio and the unfolding or explicatio. The table reported on the last page of the handout summarizes this conceptual structure of folding. From the enfolded simplicity of God, which is the absolute necessity, the same unity unfolds into numerical difference, into a mode, the necessity of complexion, which is characterized by regularity and immutability. On the other hand, matter is the enfolding, is the complicatio of the pure possibility. Matter is a basic passive potency of being that unfolds into the physical world. These different ontological dimensions of the cosmos are not perfectly symmetrical. Only the absolute necessity can be independently from the other modes. But contrary to what we might expect, it is the absolute possibility, that without which the concrete existence of the other two modes couldn't be granted. If matter did not exist, all the other modes would exist only in God, only in its pure necessity and simplicity. Roughly put, both the necessity of complexion and the determinate possibility require matter as absolute potentiality and absolute possibility in order to concretely exist. This is clarified in another passage from Thierry's Lectiones that also helps clarifying mathematics and its specific object. I am referring to the last text on the handout. First of all, in this passage, Thierry illustrates the Aristotelian abstractionist model of mathematics. This discipline abstracts the forms from matter and movement and considers them as separate. However, these forms are not actually separate, for they are always conjoined to matter. For this reason, states Thierry, mathematics also grasp a certain diversity deriving from matter itself, although Thierry doesn't explain in which way mathematics does so. From this perspective, mathematics is said to accompany matter. Mathematica comitatur materia. But Thierry goes further by claiming that, I quote from the last sentence of the underlined part in text T19, Thierry claims that those things which pertain to the necessity of complexion and are considered by mathematics cannot be without matter, end of quote. I would like to take Thierry's reasoning to its most extreme conclusions. Mathematics is the discipline that investigates the necessity of complexion, the mode which is marked by regularity and immutability. The truth of mathematical objects, the true triangle, the true circle, and so forth, inhabits the necessity of complexion, the first unfolding stemming from God. This means that the mathematical objects are immutable and true. But now, from this perspective, by defending the idea that mathematical objects and their own mode, that is the necessity of complexion, need matter, Thierry seems to state not only that mathematics abstracts the forms that are always conjoined to matter. Instead, it seems to me that this statement has a major implication, namely that mathematics always applies only to possible objects, and generally, mathematics applies only to one possible world. If it were not essentially linked to matter and possibility, it would have the same necessity as God's. So matter is the possibility that grounds even mathematical objects. And this also scales down the necessity and truthfulness of mathematics, which cannot in any way be compared to the necessity and truthfulness of God. So to sum everything up, the notion of potentiality is key to distinguish William's conception of matter from Thierry's. In the case of the latter, we witness to a full-blown metaphysical investigation concerning what matter is. By contrast, in William's approach, potentiality is nowhere to be found, which is clearly consistent with him being a natural philosopher. Thank you for your attention.